Welcome, everyone, to
Yeah.
Voices for the Future. I'm Anadea Judith,
Hi, I'm Michael Wayne.
Tom
and this,
Atlee.
and this is Tom Atlee, our guest for today that I'm so excited to have. I met Tom, oh gosh, years ago, I suppose, up at the Evolutionary Conference, was it? And was very impressed with your work and started reading your stuff then and love talking to you. You've got so many ideas and so many ways that you use words. And I'll just start with a very short formal biography, as these things always do. Um, Tom Atlee is founder of the Co-Intelligence Institute, which is about harvesting the intelligence of the collective. He's the author of 4 books, including the Tao of Democracy, and creator of the Wise Democracy Pattern Language, which is a wonderful set of cards that you've made with all these ideas on them. His research as an independent scholar and change agent focuses on how to design politics, economics, and governance systems capable of generating collective intelligence and wisdom. He also explores the many ways of knowing, their limitations and distortions, and how they relate. He sees this work as essential for the survival of humanity and as a manifestation of evolution becoming conscious of itself, to which I would highly agree. He lives and works in a co-op house in Eugene, Oregon, and we're just delighted to have you. There's so much to talk about with you. I'm glad we've got 90 minutes, and let's get started. You want to say a little bit of what your past has been that brought you to this work right now?
Well, I was born into a progressive family with a socialist economist father and a controversial social worker mother who was interested in evolution and what Eastern spirituality and all that stuff. And then I went to Antioch College, which is a very liberal college. And that was during the Vietnam War, and I dropped out to do draft resistance. And then the watershed experience of my life was in 1986 in the cross-country Great Peace March. It was supposed to have 5,000 people on it walking across the United States. It only had 1,200 people. And then it went bankrupt in the middle of the Mojave Desert 2 weeks into the march. And the guy who organized it said everybody should go home. And 800 people did, and they started taking away our support vehicles, and 400 people didn't. So we're left in the middle of the Mojave Desert with no support and nobody in charge. And as a result, I ended up having experience of a self-organized large group of people dealing with a very large challenges. Where do you put 400 people every night? You know, and the fact that we succeeded with nobody in charge. We had various layers of supposed governments all elected, but there was no police power. Nobody could throw anybody off the march. That was our one everybody agreed with. And during that time, not only did I experience self-organized activity, my classic example is the little, everybody's volunteer, the little team of people who's feeding everybody, the kitchen team, was getting exhausted, 20-hour work days every day. And they finally put out peanut butter and bread and said, this is what you get until we get some more help in here. And within a couple hours, they had a fully manned kitchen team. So that's an example of self-organized activity. And then there were times of palpable collective intelligence. It's like feeling the group mind think through a situation that it's struggling with. And I could tell it sort of gets into specifics, but I'm not gonna go into it at the moment. But at the beginning of the Tao of Democracy, one of my books, and on my website, my cointelligence.org website, there's an article called "How to Make a Decision Without Making a Decision" that describes the fertilizer factory story, which was our biggest, most consequential decision together. And I came off of that march, realizing something different. It was something different about how people are together and how people do things together. I had been part of consensus kinds of activities, both my Quaker Quaker background and co-op house living and that sort of thing, activist groups that were consensus based. And there was a lot of good stuff there and a lot of inefficiency and craziness. So you have these good, sane, intelligent people trying to make the world a better place and collectively acting crazy and stupid. And the same thing happened in some hierarchical organizations I've been part of, where the purpose was really good, all the people were very dedicated to be part of it, and yet they manifested collective stupidity and collective insanity of various kinds while they're together. So I became fascinated with that because the Peace March was something totally different from either of those. And that set me on the road to exploring how to do that kind of thing differently. And I was first trying to just help activist groups and then realized that I was trying to help a part of the whole be better than the other parts of the whole. And so I started to shift my thinking into how to bring these understandings and methodologies to communities. And then it became democracy is our main way of making collective decisions. So why don't we figure out how to do democracy that way for the whole society? So that's sort of a quickie story of the path that led me into this inquiry, which ultimately became an inquiry into wise democracy, how to make a democracy which in all of its aspects is generating collective wisdom.
So why don't you tell us how you see wise democracy? What is it? How do you describe it?
Well,
Define it.
my definition of wisdom, working definition, not all definitions of wisdom, and everybody has different different definitions of wisdom, but my working definition for this project is taking into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit. So it's not an exact thing, but it's like justice, that the justice isn't an exact thing. There's all sorts of dimensions to justice, and it's never have a fully just society. But you can see when you're approaching that or when you're falling away from that. So that kind of wisdom is what I'm talking about, and collective, who are either we the people, all the people, demos is the people, that's the root of democracy, the rule by the people, and or this other definition, which is those who are impacted by or involved with a situation should make the decisions about that situation. So that's another
The
definition.
stakeholders,
Yes, so there's a
not the
we the people,
stockholders.
not the stockholders, and
Uh,
stakeholder in a definition that includes everybody who's involved. These are and from my wise democracy perspective, there's a situation, there's a lot of people who are co-creating that situation for better and or worse. And if you can have those people become collaborators in touch with each other, talking and exploring and building better ways to do what they're doing, the situation shifts. So that's a whole section of my work that is exploring stakeholder-based democracy in contrast with we the people. We the people is place-based. You are a citizen of a community, you are a citizen of a state or a nation or whatever. There's a place-based center to that, and stakeholders are based on an issue domain, education, security, whatever. So ideally, you'd have ways of generating wisdom in both of those camps and having them intersect. And there's a funny way in which every stakeholder is a citizen, every citizen is a stakeholder. So it should be easy to do, but it's useful, different perspectives. So some of the breakthroughs I had just within the last several years had to do with where and how can we weave those two visions of where the wisdom should come from together so that it's even more multidimensional, deeper, deeper insight, taking into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit. Stakeholders already know, what's going on in the scene, so they can bring all their knowledge into the conversation. And
Mhm.
we, the people, are the people who are who have the values of the community and what it's like to be an ordinary person in the midst of what goes on in a community. And so there's two very relevant pieces of understanding that those two kinds of people can bring to a conversation, uh, and then implement stakeholders. If you have all the stakeholders, the implementation happens instantaneously. You don't have to
Yeah.
wait on some governments to do something.
Yeah. Yeah, Tom, let me ask you as kind of a overview question about American democracy, or perhaps democracy in other countries, but American democracy, considering that we just came out of 4 years of democracy wobbling. But what do you think American democracy gets right and also gets wrong?
Uh, well, the human rights definition of democracy is a major step in the right direction. You know, our Bill of Rights kind of stuff. It has a downside, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know how much to go off into these branches, but like the fight for the rights of rivers, there's some indigenous people who go, rivers don't have rights. We have responsibilities to rivers. The indigenous consciousness doesn't think in terms of rights, which is a separation thing. You can't mess with me because I have rights. Whereas the indigenous thing is we're all embedded together in this ecosystem, in this world, and we have obligations to each other. Uh, so it's a whole different frame of reference. But setting that aside, once you get into a separate, society of individuals, separate entities, it's really important to have rights. So that was a big contribution of democracy, and a lot of the battles that are going on around that are very, very relevant and important. Uh, the electoral scene is fundamentally flawed at a very deep level, majoritarian and representative. To have majorities who win, the winner take all majoritarian frame of reference, means that you always generate minorities.
Mhm.
And this, totally aside from the fact that minorities should have rights and they're just being beaten down, blah, 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 is you have the minority, whoever the minority is trying to get power to defeat what the majority just did. So you have this swing you can see from left to right kind of in our government. You know, we have Obama, and it's like some people are cheering and some people saying, oh my God. And then you get Trump, and some people are cheering and some people are saying, oh my God. It's like that's built into the system. And because it's majoritarian, you just need your 51% to win. And so people move into two camps, because if you have three different options, it's really hard to get 51%. So the system itself dictates that we will be in opposite camps fighting each other. It's set up for battle. And most of the studies that I have mean practically every perspective on an issue has something useful to support. It has limitations and it has gifts. And what we're set up to do is, on my side, I ignore the limitations on my side and I push how it's so good. And the other side is ignoring the limitations of its side and pushing its part of what's so good. And there's no conversation where we go, let's just sort all this out together. What's the things that are really useful and valuable from your perspective? What are the things that are really useful from your perspective? And just realize that there's 5 or 20 or 2,000 different perspectives too. It's not just two. If you can have those kind of conversations and those kinds of gathering of information and perspective, you can end up with something that takes into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit, as opposed to what we have now, which is totally inadequate solutions to virtually everything that goes into that machine. It comes out, and so those are the two giant pieces of the puzzle that I think are good or bad. And random selection is a whole nother dimension. That's the way Athens, our supposed forebears, founders of democracy, did not run primarily on majoritarian vote. They ran primarily on random selection. Most of the government officials were chosen by random selection, and the group called the Boule 500 Athenians, who were chosen by random selection every year, they created most of the proposals that were then voted on in the assembly, et cetera. It's like their sense that we the people are participating in every level of, no matter who you were, if you were a citizen, which is a free male with parents who lived in Athens, you were doing government. It's not that you were electing somebody else to be government for long periods of time. You yourself, you'd have a hard time getting through your life without serving on some government post.
Truly participatory.
Massively participatory. And there's a line of Aristotle which says that
Yeah.
the people in Athens think that voting favors the oligarchs and random selection favors the people. It was a really interesting, and this is Aristotle is held up as this great brilliant founder of philosophy and all that. And it's like hardly anybody quotes that to us. So, and there's many different ways to do random selection, which I could talk about for hours, which are very creative, including randomly selecting 2 million people to vote for the president. It's like, wait a minute, what about all our, except if you did the random selection, it'd be much harder to do the manipulations that happen in our current system. That's just one wild idea, often aside from people who are discussing this.
Well, you said earlier when we were discussing before the call started that the Greeks saw this random selection as giving the gods an opportunity to participate in the selection.
Yeah, so if it was important, you let the gods decide. That was their way of thinking. They didn't think of it as like surveyors do, of a demographic representation, of the population. It was like, no, we're just turning it over to the gods.
So we know about the, of the people, by the people, for the people. But you also take that, I think, up a notch when you say we can evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. And when I hear that as the whole, and I hear the people sounds like individuals, and the whole sounds like looking at what this does from the whole. And you have different aspects of the whole that you talk about.
Yeah, so one aspect of the whole, and all of these aspects are equally valid and important, and how far can you push them is the question. The thing that you said, the evoking and engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole, I call tongue-in-cheek the prime directive of wise democracy, because that's what everything is supposed to help us do. Everything in the wise democracy ideas is to help us do that. So one of the whole is we the people, the whole. It's like, instead of we the people all divided, how can we bring people together in conversations that help generate some kind of coherence that everybody thinks is a good idea? And many people don't think that's possible, but it's been demonstrated in wildly various situations that you can get a highest common denominator kind of thing, often some solution or perspective possibility that wasn't even thought by anybody, any of the participants at the start, but people generated something new that caught all their attention. Went, oh yes, collective aha kind of thing. So using that kind of power is one way to get a we the people kind of whole. And then there's all the people in the situation, which I kind of mentioned before, all the stakeholders. These are the people who are already co-creating whatever's going on. Get them together and have them figure out how to co-create the situation better than what they've been doing. That's another whole, and there's like all the perspectives, the sense that there's things to understand about this situation you're considering. How are you arranging it to understand more and more and more, instead of carving it up into pieces and throwing some of those pieces away. It's like, how can you embrace the whole of the situation? And there's ways to do that. And there's things like systems thinking, which is many different ways or qualify as systems thinking, but being able to think in terms of the whole, think in terms of the interconnections, and from shamanism to feedback loops. I mean, all these are different ways of accessing the whole of the dynamics of what's going on. And so that's another kind of whole. And for many people, the larger whole of the spiritual transpersonal world, which is the non-dual unitary consciousness that can be tuned in by some people in some ways to gather insight and information. That's another aspect of the whole. And to be able to use like synergy, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when you're proposing a policy or an approach to doing something from a governance standpoint, think in terms of piecing things together in ways that you get more out of it instead of less, or just forcing something into the situation. If you can bring different people or ideas together, different communities together, so that they generate more together than they did by themselves, that's another approach to, that's a resourcefulness of the whole kind of dimension. So those are all, it's just taking the whole in all the definitions you could think of for the whole as your standard, and recognizing that the whole, in whichever way you frame it, has potential wisdom that can be drawn out if you know how to do it, and also capacity. It has abilities, it has resources that can be used to deal with situations. So we're going to look for both of those. That's what we're called to do in more holistic governance or wise democracy. We're called to try and figure out how to do those things really well.
How do you get people to move from their individualistic thinking to the whole?
Well, there's many different ways for that. If you're thinking of in the room, you're having a conversation, if I take your question to be happening there, one of the most powerful archetypal kinds of ways of doing that is a process called dynamic facilitation, which is centered on people feeling heard. People come into the room, they're part of a conflicted situation, they have their sense of what the problem is, their sense of what should be done about it, and it's different from one person to another person to another person. They all have this different sense of what's supposed to happen and what's going on. And so the facilitator in dynamic facilitation is trained and skilled at really listening well, reflecting to the person, say, let me see if I'm getting what you're saying. Da, 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 da. With an emotional load too. You think the boss is a real asshole. It's like, okay, you really say it. And so the person feels joined, understood, heard. And when that person feels that way, which is very rare, when somebody's done it really well for me, it's like, whoa, I never had that. I never experienced that before in my life, and you relax, you open up, your message has gotten out. You don't have to run away or push or anything. You're just there. And so the facilitator is doing that with each of the people in the room. And she has 4 chart pads, one of which is proposed solutions and ways to frame the problem statements, concerns, and data. Everything that doesn't go in those first 3 goes into the data thing. Nobody's trying to prove what's right or wrong. It's just the data point somebody has put up there. And if somebody is disruptive or is insulting or attacking somebody else in the group, the facilitator goes, give me your concern. It's like their energy comes from caring of some kind. and their caring is being overridden or contradicted by somebody else. So they feel they have to push against it. And instead of saying, stop, we don't accept that kind of behavior here, the facilitator says, what's your concern? Give it to me. And puts it up on the chart pad and says, am I getting this right? You know, until that person feels well heard. And something happens during that time, whereas more and more the people feel heard, and more of the complexity of the situation is being reflected on the chart pads and in what people are hearing. And as they're watching an idealized form of listening taking place, there's a shift, and you can feel it. It's very often in the form of somebody saying, wait a minute, what if we blah, 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 blah. And at that point, the facilitator is no longer facilitating. It's become a chart padder, writing down what people are saying. And the discussion happens. Now it's all between the people who have been well heard and can listen to each other, until somebody says, no, that's stupid. And she goes, give me your concern. So it's now an acupuncture point, kind of poking at it whenever it goes off the rails. And out of that kind of conversation, which the guy who created it, Jim Ruff, says is choice creating. That's what he calls this kind of conversation. We are all looking at the whole, here we are again. We are all looking at the whole situation and all the different things people have said about it. And now we want to make sense of that. We as a collective want to make sense of that and solve it. That's an impulse, a compulsion that people have to make sense of things in all sorts of ways that don't make sense from the outside, but they need to have some sense of it in order to have a coherent, meaningful life. So if we're all doing that with this complex problem, the chances that we're going to come to a breakthrough, insight, solution, possibility are really high. So that's an example. And then if you can take doing that kind of thing and have millions of people watching it be done, there's a shift in what people think is possible. And there was a activity that was done by Maclean's magazine in Canada in 1991, where they did a 2.5-day session with people chosen to represent the diversity of Canada. Maclean's magazine is like a Time magazine of Canada. It's a major news weekly. And they did this, and then they gave it 40 pages of coverage. So you get to learn about each person who was chosen. 12 people were chosen to represent the diversity of Canada. And then you watch them interact. And you watch them, by the end of the second day, they were ready to kill each other. It was just going nowhere. And then there was a breakthrough, not from the facilitators, but from 2 women. One woman from Canada was really listening to a woman from Quebec. And there was this big emotional breakthrough, sense of possibility, blah, blah, blah. And the next morning, the woman from Quebec asked the woman who's the Native American original peoples, Native and indigenous woman, says, how is it for you? And really listens to her. And then suddenly there's this breakthrough, and they end up creating this statement of their vision for Canada together that gets printed in the magazine. So, and there was a video version of that, a public affairs program that millions of people watched. Millions of Canadians witnessed this different kind of conversation of people coming together. And suddenly they're going, wait a minute, why are we doing all this other stuff instead of that? You know, and they started to drag politicians into the conversation on talk radio and stuff like that. And the politicians went, whoa, let's just throw oil on the water, let's cool this down. And from my perspective, I have a whole research that I did on the Maclean's thing. My perspective, they didn't realize they were doing Maclean's didn't realize they were doing a democratic innovation. They thought they were doing a fancy focus group. And it's like, if they had done it the next year, part of what would be discussed in that was what happened the last time. You know, there'd be an iterative feedback loop. And it's like, suddenly the sense of we the people would start to grow because of that. And we the people is an agent in the world, you know. And it's like, we're not going to stand for this anymore. most of the people who say we're we the people are representing a side. We're the people who are going to protest this war, or we're the people who are going to invade Congress, or whatever it is. We the people is almost always a side, because we don't know how to make a coherent, valid, legitimate we the people that is inclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Tom, since you went to Canada, and in your writings on your blog, you write about other countries who've done these wise democracy initiative programs. So I'd like to journey around the world. You talked about South Africa when Mandela was freed, and the transition to a change of the government, how that came to be, and the conversations that went on, and also Taiwan and virtual Taiwan, which I found really interesting. So yeah, I'd like to hear a little more on both of those. I think everyone would like to.
Yeah, the thing in South Africa actually was a stakeholder centered scenario exploration, and this was before the revolution was won and the government turned over. Some people who were part of scenario development within Shell Oil Company. Shell Oil Company created a whole new way of doing scenario strategic planning. Instead of saying, here's what we're going to do as a strategic plan, they went, if this happens in the world, how are we going to respond? And if this happens in the world, how are we going to respond? They do a bunch of thinking about scenarios in a very systematized way. And then looking at the scenarios, going, which one of these do we want to have happen, and how can we help that? How can we participate in helping that happen? And so some of the people who were familiar with that went to South Africa and pulled together leaders, the people from Mandela's movement, people from the Communist Party, people from the government, and a number of the sort of independent tribes that were their own political and military forces. And they did scenario work, which resulted in a set, I think it was either 4 or 5 possible scenarios for South Africa. And they looked at those scenarios, and the people who advocated particular scenarios earlier, sort of all came together and went, now that we've really looked at what would happen if we did X, Y, and Z, it makes sense to do G or Q, whatever it was. And then they created newspaper insert for describing all those scenarios and what they saw as the consequences of those trying it in different ways. And it was, their final scenario was this mixed government that was not a communist or socialist government. It was, more mainstream kind of government. And they put it out through all these newspapers to the population, and the population had discussions about it. And they ended up basically doing it. That had an influence on all the participants were influenced by that scenario work. And that's basically what happened when Mandela was released and elected president. And it sort of eased the fears of the international investment community, and eased the fears of both the blacks and the whites in South Africa. And sort of, it wasn't ideal from all perspectives, but it was the only thing that was going to work once they really looked at it. So that's what went on there. And it was not made into a permanent institution, but it could be. Given the possibilities of what just happened there, you could make a government system that had that as a major aspect of it. In Taiwan, what happened during the Occupy movement in Taiwan was a popular takeover of the Parliament building. I realized, so I was thinking about it today, I went, well, that's on the face of it, similar to the effort to take over the Congress that happened here, but the underlying thing was very different. The actual action was they took over parliament, and they were, because of their particular history, they had a very active civic hacker world. The people who were technologically sophisticated programmers and whatnot, who were there, whose purpose in life was to help democracy flourish, and they were heavily involved in that and in that takeover. And they used the fact that people were all together to start talking about the issue that was the main reason they took over parliament, which was a secret negotiation of a treaty with mainland China. And they started talking about what kind of treaty do we actually want with mainland China. And so they would be projecting stuff up on the walls of the parliament where all the masses of people who were crowded in there could see it. And also they had a discussion going with hundreds of thousands of people in the country online that was woven together between the people who were occupiers and the people who were watching it all. And after, I think it was 3 weeks. I think it was 3 weeks. They occupied the parliament, and then parliament got back and took their thing. And then they voted and did the thing that the people had wanted. And the next election, a whole pile of the people who'd been involved in the occupation were elected to government.
Wow.
And then went on and appointed some of their colleagues to be in appointed positions. And one of those people, one of the leaders of what was called Gov0, which was the hacker community, became the digital minister without portfolio for the entire federal government. Anything that had anything to do with electronic online sorts of stuff, she was in charge of all that. And she arranged to have every ministry, bureau in the bureaucracy, had to have a participation officer. And then she arranged this fascinating, I have major descriptions of this on my blog. If you look up, go to tomatleeblog.com and look up V Taiwan in the as a search, all one word, V Taiwan. You will get my 5-part discussion of what was going on in V Taiwan. And they have this. This was not operating at the level of the parliament. This was operating at the bureaucracy level, the regulation level. So if you had an issue, you had a regulation you wanted to have put in place, you wanted to have a regulation you wanted to get rid of, you wanted to change the regulation, change the enforcement, whatever your thing was that had to do with regulations, you could come to a Wednesday sort of open space thing, what do they call it, hackathon. And you don't have to be a hacker to be in the hackathon. Anybody can walk off the street and show up and say, this is what I want to have happen. I want to see this happen. And anybody who was there could join them, and enough people joined them, the process would begin. Nobody was there approving or disapproving of whatever happened. It's just, if there's energy, that's what we run with. And they would first discuss, okay, let's get down to specifics. What is it we're talking about? Let's articulate that, put it up online. And then they did what they called a snowball survey. They would go on to Facebook, and different stakeholder groups from all different angles on that particular issue, they would survey, send this, they put an announcement in an ad, they'd buy an ad in that Facebook group and have people respond to these questions. How are you involved in this issue? Who else is involved? Who's important? What are the issues that people are talking about? And the last question was, who else should we send the survey to? And so they collect all these surveys, and then they would build like a Wikipedia page about that issue, which covered all the different perspectives and what was going on. And it was part of their culture to make it so that anybody, any ordinary person, could read that page.
Yeah. If I may add that I remember reading this woman's, she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. Actually, I got it through your blog. I saw the link, I read it, and she said the aim was to crowdsource democracy to create a more responsive government. And it's amazing.
and the fact that anybody could show up sort of blew me away. And there's a process called open space, which is sort of everybody doing what they want. And one of the things when you're an open space facilitator, the ideal is to just be picking up the cups, coffee cups. You're not actually doing it because everybody else is doing what's going on. And so when I was talking to her, I said, how do you have time? You're the major digital minister of a federal government of a country. How do you have time to talk to me? We talked for 9 hours. And she said, well, I just go around picking up the coffee cups, Anyway, so they build this informational page, and then they do a participatory survey called Paulis, which is also featured on my website. And it's a survey in which there's a bunch of statements that are fed into it, different thoughts on the issue, whatever the issue is. And then people respond to those thoughts with an agree, disagree, pass. And anybody can add in their own statements of what they think is relevant or what they think should be done, or what they think shouldn't be done, whatever it is. And to this growing number of these statements and more people participating and saying, I agree, disagree, and adding in their items. So it's expanding survey with more and more dimensions going on. And there's an AI and artificial intelligence thing that's built into it that is sorting out all these people into groups. Usually it's like 2 to 3 or 4 groups of people who think similarly but different from each other. So groups think different from each other, but the people within the group are thinking similarly. And it is noticing for each statement how the agreement and disagreement patterns are between the groups. So one of the most important things that it's discovering is when there's consensus about something, not over the overall, but among the different groups. So people coming from different directions are actually agreeing on this statement. And so it's giving you a picture when it publishes its results, which in some versions of it, get anybody who's participating can get a picture of the results at any given time as it's unfolding. But it's like an ecosystem of perspectives. And you can say which perspectives are popular and which perspectives are not. And that's not used to say what the decision is. That's used to inform a face-to-face conversation of stakeholders, including the participation officers from any relevant agencies. They have to participate in this discussion. And so there's a facilitated conversation which moves towards, and they look at the things that people agreed with, things people disagreed with. And then they have, after that conversation, which is videoed, live streamed, with chat function going on all the time during it, and archived. One of the standards of vTaiwan is everything is transparent. Anybody can see what's going on in vTaiwan. All the conversations I had, Audrey Tang, who's this woman, trans woman, all of those conversations are up on YouTube. She won't talk to anybody unless it's going to be on YouTube. So, and then they have a negotiation. Yes,
complete transparency.
Yeah.
Complete transparency and an intention to help the ministers do their job.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, we are the people forcing you to do something. It's like, we are here to help you manage the area that you're in charge of in a way that kind of works for everybody. And then there's the last step is this negotiation between the ministers who are stakeholders and other stakeholders to actually craft new policy on that area. And that's like, whoa, I had never run across something that sophisticated before in my life. And it's something that you can't, lots of lessons are in there, but you can't just transplant it, because they had this community of civic hackers. And if you don't have that community of civic hackers and some history that's parallel, you're not going to be able to do it. But you can learn from it. And Polis is being used quite broadly now. More and more people are using Polis, that participatory polling.
So how do you scale that up from a small area like Taiwan to a big country like the US or the EU, or, you know?
Well, Taiwan is not that small, It has millions of people in it. And again, there's a mixture of, and I haven't thought of how to scale it up from Taiwan, because Taiwan is sufficiently large and it's a federal government activity. It's not a subset of the federal government. But I can easily pick thoughts off the shelf and talk about it. The idea of visibility that was in the Maclean's magazine initiative, if a government wanted to, or if there were nonprofits or activist groups or whatever who were willing to take on the function of engaging people in conversations about what was going on, and doing either I think Polis can do large numbers of people, millions of people can participate in Polis, but it gets, the more people there are and the more statements that are being generated, the more important moderation becomes. You see several statements that are similar, you combine them and all that. It gets more and more complex with more people participating. But something that isn't actually done broadly enough is creating parallel initiatives that are virtually identical, and or using random selection. So in the United States, doing random selection of the whole country, doing what they did in Taiwan, and doing, say, 6 of those, and looking for similarities and differences in what came up between those.
And would you do that on a particular issue, like do that on climate change,
right.
or do that on immigration, or?
Yes, I would. That's one of the things. From a theoretical standpoint, when you do a randomly selected group of people and put them through a particular process, those people who advocate for that approach, which I am one of the people, say that's we the people, and it's like the juries. That's the only thing we have that's similar to that in the United States and most of the Western countries. We randomly selected a bunch of people, dozen, not very big, but dozen people. And then we turn over sometimes issues that involve millions of dollars or somebody's life or death, whether you're going to give them guilty, they're going to be killed. It's like there's big stuff that goes on with these 12 people. So it's not a small thing. But when we do just one of those, we grant it the right to almost symbolically represent the whole. So like the Queen of England is we do this, we do that. There's a sense of the Queen, the royalty embodies, or the president. They say the US is doing this. Well, not the US, it's some president or some representatives of the government, but we give them the right to represent the whole. From a wise democracy perspective, if we're going to do a inclusive deliberation of some kind, like they did in Taiwan, very sophisticated version, I would love to see several of those being done in parallel, separately from each other, and comparing the results. If results were similar, that would be a tremendous breakthrough, because we would then be able to do one and trust that it was working. It's sort of like the pollsters. They do a poll, and from their research, they say these results have a what is it, the error?
Yeah.
A margin of error.
Margin of error of 3% or 6%. that's from previous things they have done to test out comparisons of similar polling and seeing how they differ from each other. We haven't done that in the deliberative democracy world. So ideally, we would do that. And then if there were significant differences, what do we do then? We could do another layer. It's like, I mean, I can describe my ideal. It's getting a little late, so I'm reluctant to go too far into it. But I have an ideal form of research to explore this issue in order to understand more deeply the legitimacy of a citizen deliberative council. Is what I call it, a citizen panel. And if there are differences in one particular design, there are differences between the 3 or 6 or whatever panels that you have convened. What do you do next when your intention is to have a legitimate voice of the whole? You know, I thought in terms of have 3 citizen panels and 3 stakeholder panels, all independent, all on the same issue, all designed to be, each set of 3 is designed to be similarly run and chosen. And then if they came up with things that were significantly different, make 6 more panels, each of which included members of all 6 of the other panels. So let's, and then use dynamic facilitation on those and see what happened. You know, there's ways to move towards more and more coherence that is inclusive, and to keep doing that and have that be a field of research. Again, if we want to generate collective wisdom, there's something to know and something to explore.
Tom, I want to ask you a question about citizens' initiatives in the United States, different, I don't know if you'd even call it a form of wise democracy. It gets so corrupted, but some states can get, you know, the people can petition and get a referendum, get initiative on the ballot chosen. So what do you think of those? They get corrupted often by big money.
Yes, and we had in Oregon, where I live, we had, it's a little on ice at the moment, this thing called the Citizen Initiative Review, which is you take an initiative and you pick 1 or 2 dozen voters at random in the voting lists to come together for 3 to 5 days, talk to people who are for the initiative, talk to people against the initiative, talk to academics who are experts in the initiative field, et cetera, and then come up with a set. Here are, if you are for this initiative, here's good arguments for it. If you're against the initiative, here's good arguments against it. And they used to have, here's what we voted on and here's how we came out. They've since dropped that because people complained it was trying to tell voters how to vote. But it's like comparing the 2 and doing the kind of research that citizens don't have a chance to do, and that they don't have access to fair something. All the information they have is biased either for or against, and it's really hard for them to do comparisons and sort out what makes sense or what doesn't. So here's a group of people who are doing work for the voters. They are voters, they're doing work for the voters, and their information gets printed in the voter pamphlet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was done for years in almost a decade in Oregon, and some other states were looking at it, and there's been a few other experiments elsewhere. Primary weakness from my perspective was that it was only done with a few of the initiatives each election, because although it was authorized by the government, the state government, it wasn't paid for by the state government. So an independent foundation was set up to raise money to run these things, and it was like $150,000 for each one of them that they did. And so it was like, we can only afford to do a few of them each time. And there's big discussions of how do you pick. If you had it done with every single one of the initiatives, people would think twice before they put fucked up initiative into the system. But since if there's only 2 out of the 6 or 8 initiatives that are going to get done, it's worth the risk to put a mess up initiative on the ballot. So if you had all of them done, it would be a big step in removing the manipulation that goes on. But it's also an initiative is a solution. You don't have a conversation to find out what's the best solution. The initiative presents you with a solution, and you do pro or con. So it very limits the amount of wisdom that can be generated. And it's usually some side, somebody already knows what they want to see happen, who makes the initiative. The ideal, one of the patterns in the pattern language is that solutions and proposals are emergent. They come out of the conversation. And that has a higher chance of generating something that has a wise outcome. And people who want direct democracy, that whole approach, to me, the direct democracy thing, if everybody votes on everything, I go, given the conditions in our world, that's even worse than what we have. It's highly participatory and really low potential for wisdom. But there is an interesting innovation in Austria, a state called Vorarlberg in Austria, where they have very sophisticated citizen council process that they use. And in the constitution, the state constitution now, if 1,000 people sign a petition to have one of these citizen councils convened on a particular issue, the state must convene it. So that's a different kind of thing, rather than we are petitioning to have a particular proposal put before the voters. You're petitioning to have a high quality conversation on an issue, which is a very different thing.
And then what would become of that conversation? Does it get?
Well, it's first of all, it uses dynamic facilitation. So that's already a step far ahead of most such conversations. And they do randomly selected group of people to be in it. And they have a public meeting with media and stakeholders and government officials and anybody who wants to come, where they do the report out. And then it is turned over to what they call a responder group, which is a group of stakeholders, people from the government who are in charge of this, people from the private sector, people from the nonprofit sector, who are dealing with that issue in some way or another. And here's what the citizens want is turned over to them, and they are responsible to do what they can to implement it and report back. And how that unfolds, depending on the energy from the people, it unfolds in really powerful ways or in less powerful ways. There is information available on online, and again, you can access it through my blog. There's information. I should say Vorarlberg has a oh boy, there's lots of stuff in the chat I haven't seen.
Yeah.
Vorarlberg,
Maybe you can type
Austria, and it's Citizens Council. It should be Berg, Vorarlberg. Yeah, it's in German because they're in Austria, so it's hardly, the research is only started to be done on that. But they did one like 4 years ago on the immigration and migration situation, refugees, which was really hot all over Europe, including Austria. And they did one, and the research that was done after, and there's lots of material in English on that particular refugee and immigration citizen council. And what they came up with was very welcoming to these people. They wanted to see more, not just rejecting people, but welcoming people, and ways to do that. And that gave a bunch of politicians permission to advocate those kinds of policies, where prior to the Citizen Council, they were in favor of that, but it was politically dangerous to talk about it. After the Citizen Council, they could actually take action on it. So that was one interesting shift that happened. And also when they did their random selection, there was no refugee on the council. And so they did a special selection to get a young refugee guy to be on the council. And everybody agreed his participation had been really valuable.
That brings us to the topic of diversity, which is really up these days. And we know that American democracy started out as rich white men, and we've been gradually becoming more diverse and gender balanced. But why is diversity so important to the whole? I mean, it's more than just making sure people are fairly treated. It's part of the whole.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. It has evolved in more sophisticated ways for rich white men to control the system.
Yeah, really.
There's been lots of progress, but there's also a way in which it hasn't changed at fundamental enough levels to have the rich excuse me, to have the rich white power holders be non-dominant factors. If we're going to have the whole, the rich white patriarchs need to be part of the whole, but it needs to be set up so that they aren't shaping the whole, manipulating the whole, biasing the whole in ways that make it hard to see the whole anymore and hear the whole, which is what happens when it's one of the bad feedback loops in the society. Is the more money you have, the more impact you can have on the society, and the more impact you can have on the society, the more money you can get. So it's like
and then we sacrifice diversity, and we sacrifice our wholeness.
Yes, and there's a dance going on now. The dance it centers on race and gender, probably because those are the most visible forms of diversity. But that diversity, when we use the word diversity, what we mean 90% of the time is racial or gender or some other identity that we have used to create systems of privilege and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And the word, when you talk about biodiversity, you're not talking about that. You're talking about differences of all kinds.
And you talk about cognitive diversity, which I love because it's different kinds of thinking. And maybe you can touch on that also.
There's just from the last 8 or 10 years, I've learned the academic language for that is epistemic diversity. Mm-hmm. And that's different. People think differently. People have different ways of coming at a problem. Mm-hmm. And there's very little research on collective intelligence, like at the group level, group intelligence, actual research, different kinds of groups and watching what they do. And the two things so far that seem to be established by that research is, number one, the percentage of women in the group increases. The more women there are in the group, the wiser the results are, not because women are smarter in some way, but because they know much better than men how to collaborate, how to listen to each other. And it's the collaboration and listening which make the difference. And the other thing is the cognitive diversity. There's a number of studies that have shown that. So, woman Helene Landemore, who has collected a lot of these things, she has a book, Collective Wisdom, and several other books. One of the few academics who actually uses the word wisdom and combines wisdom and democracy. So having those kinds of diversity that is relevant to the issue that you're dealing with. And then once you get the diversity that is relevant to the issue, and you have a way of, I like to use the word digesting. Digesting is taking something and getting the useful parts of it, so you can be nutrition, you can get the nutrition out of it. So there's cognitive nutrition to be gotten from all the diversity, but if you don't have the right process, the right communications, it degrades into the different diversity parts fighting each other.
Yeah.
So having the right process and the diversity, and I have a page on human diversity that lists like 50 different kinds of diversity, and we have lost the sense that that even exists because we're so fixated on the
Yeah.
oppression and privilege, which is absolutely vital. I mean, queer, I think it's vital for us to deal with the power dynamics and the histories and the responses of people in real time to engaging with each other. Those are necessary for it, but it is really a tragedy to lose the sense of the spectrum of diversity that we have available to us to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. You talked about using diversity and disturbance creatively. It was one of your principles.
Yes, that's one of the patterns in the pattern language. And for
And we've
me,
had a lot of disturbance lately. So
yes.
how do we use that creatively?
Well, again, I can just touch back to what dynamic facilitation does. If you don't have, I've watched dynamic facilitation function in a system where there isn't conflict built in, and it hardly does anything. The more conflict there is, the better dynamic facilitation works, because there's energy there. People care, and that caring. What is so tragic from one perspective? What is so tragic about our dysfunctional social systems and government systems is they waste the caring. They waste people's caring. They're designed to channel caring in directions that get in the way of other people's caring, instead of finding ways to care together. And so that is really one of the saddest things. And so you can say there's caring in diversity and disturbance. So dynamic facilitation is one example of how to deal with that. On a more familiar level, when someone makes a mistake, they're bad because they made the mistake, or here's something we can learn from. That's using disturbance.
Making medicine out of it.
Yeah.
So
If you have a pain in your body, this goes into holistic medicine. If you have a pain in your body, do you just try and get rid of it or suppress it? Or do you go, where is this coming from? And how far down the chain of causation? The holistic medicine often deals with lifestyle, levels of consciousness, the ways you think about what's going on in your life, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are deeper levels. This is using it creatively to expand your understanding, to expand your personal capacity and growth. And organizations and groups can do that too. If you have dissonance in the group, how are you going to handle it? Are you going to suppress voices, or are you going to learn and do something special with it?
What did you do about the Capitol insurrection that we had in January? How would you use this to address the Capitol insurrection we had in January?
Well, again, the sense of people not feeling heard is what's going on all the different sides of this. So if I was, it's like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were innovated in South Africa, something along that line. And there's a funny way, again, the parallel to holistic medicine, where the original pain or suffering, discomfort, whatever it is, the original disturbance is a starting place to explore for what are the deeper things that are going on, and to address those. You're not the healer, although the person may want to just get rid of the discomfort and the pain, the patient. The healer is interested in how to make things whole. That's what health and healing is about. The word whole comes from that. So it's like similar. You have some disruption, like the Black Lives Matter demonstration, or like the attack on the Capitol. It's like, this is a signal to pay attention and explore how to create more wholeness out of all these people. So that would be my inquiry. And it's not like, oh, here's a big horrible thing, what are you going to do about it, Tom? It's like a different starting place, a different frame of reference. There's actually potential gifts contained within that diversity. And how do we tap those gifts is the question. Having more of the people in power and more of the activists on all sides asking those questions. There's a movement in the US called the transpartisan movement, where people who, it's framed in terms of left and right, and I'm not sure I agree with the habitual framing of things in terms of left and right, liberal and conservative. But for those people who are in that framing, they ask, or they say, go ahead and be your full-scale conservative or your full-scale progressive. Accept that identity. We're all going to accept that identity. Now let's talk. And let's really hear each other and be willing to shift because of what we hear, but we're not expecting each other to shift. We're just entering into authentic conversation. And our liberal and conservative positions are our starting places. So that's one of the places. There's an inspiring group. They've changed their name, and I can't remember their name at the moment, but their first form was the Public Conversations Project, and they were famous in the 90s for getting pro-life and pro-choice activists together to talk.
Right.
And they did very creative stuff where they had a dozen of these activists together, and none of them knew which side they were on. But they're gathered together in the same room. And the invitation was, everybody in this room feels really strongly about this issue. Something happened in your life to make you feel so strongly. Please share that story. And so the first time they find out who's pro-life and who's pro-choice is in the context of the personal story. You can't disagree with the personal story. It's just what happened. So it's a very right away, you're depolarizing it. And then they go, in our system, we have to join in solidarity with other people with whom we may have lots of disagreements, but we need to gather together in order to be politically effective. So we have these two sides, pro-life, pro-choice. There's lots of different people on the pro-life side. There's lots of different people on the pro-choice side. So, and it's politically risky to talk about that because you want to have the solidarity for being effective. But nobody, this is a confidential discussion. Nobody's going to be talking about it without your permission. So let's go around the room and each person talk about the gray areas and how they're on this side, but there's certain things they aren't fully comfortable with from that absolute side's perspective. And so you go around the room and talk about that, and you find out there's not two sides. There's a whole spectrum, you know, and that's where you discover it. So things like that, there's lots of people who've done really creative work in this area. So here's a hot topic. People are hot enough to go try and invade the Capitol. It's like, where's the conversation which holds all of that?
Yeah. So, Tom, I want to ask you a question on the future, and then I think from there we'll open it up to other people might have questions. What kind of future do you see for democracy, and what gives you a sense of the possibilities?
Well, there is a great, one of the most promising things is the expansion of random selection and citizen council kinds of things, citizen assemblies, which were pushed most strongly by Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And there's now Extinction Rebellion people around the world, and there's Extinction Rebellion has shifted a lot of their attention from climate specifically to democracy, because the reason climate is not being changed is because we don't have a democracy that works. So there's a lot of people doing creative work on democracy and Extinction Rebellion. And the citizen assemblies are cropping up with government sponsorship in a lot of different places now, including, and not only that, one of the things I especially love is there are experiments. People are trying new ways of doing the conversations, new ways of doing the random selection that are very creative. So I sense a lot of creativity emerging in that space. And then in the stakeholder space, several years ago, two different colleagues were independently having a realization that there are places where multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-scale networks within a particular issue domain are trying to work together. They don't necessarily know how to work together, but they're trying, and the three of us got together and spent about 6 months doing research in this and promoting it, in the sense that this is already happening. Like all the sustainable development goals the UN has put out, there's 17 of them. And this guy who's working internationally with people and including on the sustainable development goals says, I'm noticing that more and more different players, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-scale networks of players are trying to do shared work under each of the sustainable development goals. Nobody's organizing it. It's just happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it's just happening, and that, both of these people, that guy and this other woman, both noticed that this is an emerging form of governance. This includes and transcends government, because the people who are involved with each of these sustainable development goals, who are parts of government, are part of those efforts, but they're not in charge. They're not the end game. They're just a piece of the whole system. And so this stakeholder form of governance, to the extent it's inclusive and to the extent it's collaborative, they know how to collaborate, offers unbelievable promise for sane governance that takes into account what needs to be taken into account. Partly because they cover the whole issue, and partly because implementation is instantaneous. Once you get agreement among all the players who are already involved in the system, things happen. That was very exciting to me as a possibility. And the people who are involved in that don't see themselves as a form of governance, but they are, because they're shaping what's happening on the ground. So that's very exciting for me.
So it'd be nice to open it up to some questions on the call, because we're coming to the end in 15 minutes. So if you want to put a question to Tom, who of the listeners, you can type it into the chat box. And we have a couple comments that have come in. Should I read the one from Grace, Michael?
Yeah, and Carolyn a little higher also has it. So why don't you read the one from Grace and I'll read the one from Carolyn.
Okay. Grace says, the Austrian model looks like it addresses the importance of deeper layered, broader understanding of issues and the necessary ripple consequences of any action. This can lead to wiser solutions and be an indicator against narrow short-term solutions. What I would like to see is an emphasis on broad-based information sharing done for everyone that incorporates deep listening and cuts across fear, biases, and can lead to productive dialogue and consensus. That sounds like kind of summing up what you're talking about.
Yeah, actually, I have one of the models that covers a lot of these different grounds that I've developed as a collective sense-making model. It's very similar to a mixture of Vorarlberg and what goes on in Taiwan, but it also adds in mass participation in simple public conversations like world cafes, open spaces, things where lots of people can participate. And particularly at the beginning, you have lots of people participating in these things, talking to each other, and they can be organized any way you want. And then the polis harvest the insights that they've had as individuals. So you don't have to integrate these different collective conversations. You just have those conversations. And the fact that they're all different is, it doesn't no hindrance, because you're going to harvest the things that those individuals are thinking about by using Paul lists. And
Yeah.
then have the results of the Paul lists go into a conversation like the thing that they do, the citizen councils that they do in Austria. And if there was commitment, you could have the results of the Austrian model be fed back into the population with more World Cafes and conversations and media coverage and discussion of the media coverage. I mean, it's like, if you're trying to generate collective intelligence and wisdom, there's lots of ways to do it, many of which integrate, they synergize into something that's way bigger than any one of the approaches separately.
Yeah, you have a statement you made in the writings you sent us. The electronic democracy is the leading edge of public engagement. Are there pros and cons to that?
Yes, it depends on the electronic democracy. Electronic democracy, which is just everybody votes on everything, as I said before, I'm not in favor of that at all. If there's forms of electronic democracy that are used to engage people in interactions, or where it's like, what's so amazing about Paul lists is there's no direct interaction, but the AI is in service of comparisons which generate insights that usually only come about through interaction, but that's part of its uniqueness that makes me excited about it.
Yeah, I think Taiwan is really showing such a great example of this crowdsourcing democracy and electronic democracy. And in the US, like Facebook is our electronic democracy, and it's come crazy town.
Right. Well, they use Facebook too, but again, the understandings, the evoking, engaging, the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. If you get that, and then you have the question of how do we do that? You arrive at different solutions, different approaches than if you're just saying, we're a whole bag of individual citizens and we're gonna have everybody vote on everything. It's just like, that's you wouldn't come to that solution if you had that question at the beginning.
Well, it sounds like having everybody vote on everything doesn't have the deliberative process that creates new solutions.
Yes, there's not an understanding of synergy at the very least. Synergy is deeply related to wholeness.
Yeah.
The every whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the thing that weaves it into something greater is synergy. So the understanding of synergy, and that's what conversation is, the interactions between different entities to turn together. Converse is turning together, to have those interactions generated. And that's what I tried to do in the Wise Democracy pattern language, was generate understandings that, if you actually use them, will get you the evoking and engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. So
yeah. So Carolyn asked a really good question, kind of wise democracy practice and coherence. So she was wondering, are there any groups or communities combining wise democracy practices with heart coherence practices, a la heart math?
I don't know of any. I don't see any. It feels to me, in the model of having in the model of having lots of conversations, which are then harvested with Paul lists. Some of those conversations could be among people who do heart math work. Some of those conversations would be people who do meditation. Some of those people could do, the system, what they call systemic constellation work. There's all these different things that are not the usual conversation deliberation methods, but are participatory, potentially wisdom generating activities. And the fact that you can do all of them that are very different from each other and then harvest them through Paul. So for me, that would be one approach to doing that. I'm not an advocate of any separate approach as being the solution. For me, the most important thing is the inquiry, and the shape of that inquiry is in the prime directive. You know, if we're asking, how do we evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole, anything that contributes to that in any design is valuable to put forth. So I don't need everybody to be to do heart math techniques in order to participate in this thing. I just see it's another additional source of wisdom to put into the whole.
Sort of like your cognitive diversity that has reason and logic and facts and intuition and spiritual awareness and body awareness, all those different ways of knowing.
Yes.
Art math is another one, meditation is another one. They're all ways of knowing, and you
Yeah.
have that diversity, you have a better whole.
That's right. That's got it.
Yeah.
POLIS, Carolyn Schaefer, POLIS or POL.is. The original website was POL.is, but most people write it POLIS nowadays.
Yeah.
And you can
Grace
switch,
also asks, right now we have opinions, driving opinions, many manipulated by social media propaganda. So we have an exponential risk. How do we avoid this in the name of a healthy, representative populace?
Yes, well, they'd have to, that's a whole nother track of my work. There's a series of 5 posts on sense making. There's a lot of people who are now using that term, sense making. And the question of what is reality is up for grabs at the moment. And when you have what is reality up for grabs, sense making is up for grabs. You have the ability to have people who agree on a particular approach to reality who are operating in a different zone than people who are in another approach. And from the wise democracy perspective, it's more important to be able to take all the approaches and have them engage with each other. And that realm is particularly tricky. If you don't have a common ground, some kind of cognitive common ground, it gets very tricky. My own favorite definition of reality is from science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, who says reality is what's still there when you stop believing in it. So it's tied to consequences. It's tied to what actually produces results. And that includes, there's a reality that, QAnon, which seems to be so untied to reality for so many of us, is a fact. You can't act as if QAnon's not there.
Right.
QAnon is there even when you stop believing in it. There's a funny way in which taking into account all of humans' diversity of how they're dealing with things rather than just disowning them. Some people disown science, and there's lots of good reasons to disown science as it's practiced, and some people disown the, meditation and channeling, and some people disown the QAnon. It's like, how do we come together in some way that makes sense as an inquiry that's serious? It's not just, what do you call it,
well, I see that the fact is we've all been fed growing up, the lie that money's going to make you happy and to make more money, or the goal of life is to dominate and climb your way to the top, or that these are lies we've all been fed, cultural myths. So we're swimming in it.
Yeah, part of it is acknowledging the extent to which the lies and propaganda are part of our daily fare also. you know, to realize that any of these boxes or echo chambers that we're in have serious limitations. And part of what happened to me in my evolution, because I started out solid progressive across the boards. And as I have engaged more and more with those other entities who are dissed by the progressives, I find there's actually something there that's important to take into account.
That's right. Yeah.
Not just them, although that's one of the most major things to take into account. Is there's somebody who has that perspective, they need to be respected, or they're going to go underground and fight. I mean, that's part of what we're watching. Also, we're watching the dissing and marginalizing of people of color and women and others with that kind of diversity. We're watching that, the lid being taken off of the energetics that come from marginalizing. Suddenly, there's these loud voices and lots of very powerful, important things, and a lot of crap that comes with that. And we finished the Civil War and didn't finish the Civil War. And we have all those energies of the white supremacist stuff combining with how fucked up the economy is and what it's doing to people. There's a lot of that that's being suppressed, and now here's Trump saying all this stuff which we on the left can't stand, but it's voicing voices that have been suppressed, and they're coming out of the woodwork. And it's like all of that is happening simultaneously with no place to make creative use of the diversity and disturbance. It's all understandable. It's not all desirable. It's not all acceptable, but from my perspective, it's all understandable, and that's part of the messiness of a society in transformation. And that's where evolution becoming conscious of itself. To the extent we are an evolving society, are we conscious of how we're doing it, or are we just flailing through this mess, being swept this way and that way? Looks more like the latter so far.
Yeah. Unless we harvest the intelligence of everyone in the way that you talk about in co-intelligence.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end. Michael, any other questions you want to get in?
No, this was great, Tom. You know, it's I had never come across the phrase wise democracy until I read your writings, and that makes so much sense. Without a wise democracy, we're going unwise, and we don't want that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I hope that there's a way that your ideas can get out there more, Tom, and tell people how they can read up more, find you on the web, follow you. I know you've got great blogs that come out pretty often.
Yeah, the TomAtleeblog.com is one website. The co-intelligence.org is another website, which is sort of the background information on all this. And then there's the Wise Democracy, WD-PL, the WD for Wise Democracy, PL for pattern language. WD-PL.com is all the Wise Democracy stuff, which is sort of co-intelligence applied to societal dynamics.
And I love your 96 cards, each one with a concept of wise democracy. I mean, that's a really good thing too. Is that a deck that's available? Like you can buy it?
You can buy the deck. We still have 300 of them in stock, or you can download your own version of it. It's printable for free. It costs like $40 or something for the whole set in a box.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for gracing us with your wisdom, your years of exploration and thinking about these things, and bringing us into an oligarchy with the ALL instead of an OL, and moving from parties to holies. That was a phrase you said that really struck me. And from division into wholeness and ways to do that. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for joining the inquiry and furthering it.
All right.
All right. Peace.
To the
Bye-bye.
future.
So, yeah.
Namaste.
Okay. We'll see you again.